This is a tutorial on classification. The first aim is, can you identify the 7 groups we use to classify all living organisms? Then can you describe how we classify vertebrates? And then finally, can you explain the benefits of the binomial system? Let's start by considering one of nature's oddest creations. Yes, the poster child for weird animals, which is the platypus. What is a platypus? I mean, if you think about it, it's a very odd animal. It has a beak, a bill, just like a bird. It has webbed feet, like a bird. But then it's got fur, like a mammal. And on the back of its ankle, it's actually got a way of administering a poison. It also lays eggs, and it's warm-blooded. So it's a proper mix of various different animal groups, which presents biologists with a dilemma. How do we begin classifying such an odd creature? So classification is the science of putting living organisms into distinct groups depending on their characteristics. So the idea of classification was developed by the botanist Linnaeus. He observed that flowering plants had 2 types of seeds. Some seeds had an embryo with 1 vein, which he called monocotyledons, and some seeds had an embryo with 2 veins, which he called dicotyledons. So quite quickly he could separate these into 2 groups, the monocots over here and the dicots on the other side. Now, monocots developed to have veins with parallel lines like this, whereas dicots have veins fanning out. So this is one way we can classify a species, by looking at their physical characteristics. But there are just a mere 8.7 million species on this planet to classify, and those species only represent 1% of all the species that have ever lived on planet Earth, at an estimate. So the job of a classifying biologist is fiendishly complex, and there will always be exceptions to the rule, like our friend the platypus. So how do we start classifying? So there's 7 general groups that biologists lump organisms into, starting with kingdom at the top, followed by phylum, followed by class, order, family, genus, and species. You will need to remember this, so normally people develop a sort of mnemonic, a word rhyme for it. Here's one for you, if you can't think of your own. King Philip comes out for greasy sausages. So the kingdom will be the most general group with the greatest number of organisms with the fewest amount of similarities. So let's take the animal kingdom, for example. Within the animal kingdom, you have bears, you have lions, you have insects, you have fish, cuttlefish, octopuses, and so on and so on. So much variation. But as you can also see, there's very little they have in common. They have a few things in common, but not a great deal. As we go down the grouping system, we find that the numbers of organisms within the group starts to reduce significantly, but the degree of similarity between them increases significantly. So look at us, the human species. We all look very similar. We have stereoscopic vision, eyes facing the front. We have opposable thumbs. We have big brains. We can walk upright. A lot of similarity. But we are the only member of our species left, so very few in number. Okay, so now we need to find out a little bit more about specific groups. We're going to start with the kingdoms. There are 5 kingdoms you need to know about, so let's look at them in a bit more detail. Firstly, we have the prokaryotes. Prokaryotes. The prokaryotes are commonly referred to as the bacteria kingdom. This kingdom share the following 2 features. Their cells do not have a nucleus, instead their DNA is free-floating without an envelope around it. They are also unicellular, single-celled. They are the simplest kingdom we're going to learn about today. Next we have the fungi. The fungi, well, you probably recognize as things like mushrooms, toadstools, yeast, and so on. Fungi, unlike the prokaryotes, do have a nucleus inside their cells. They are also multicellular, in other words, they are made of many cells joined together. The hardest thing to remember about fungi is this word here. They are saprophytes. That means they feed on dead or rotting, decaying material. That's why you often find fungi on old tree stumps. So fungi nourish themselves by basically releasing a chemical soup of enzymes which digests whatever they're lodged to, and then they absorb the nutrients. Next up, we have the wonderful plant kingdom. Plants, like fungi, have a nucleus inside their cell. They are also multicellular, made of many cells. Their cells contain chloroplasts, which has a green pigment called chlorophyll. You can see these green dots here, chloroplasts, and they are needed for photosynthesis, which feeds into the last feature. They are autotrophs, self-feeding. So they use the energy in sunlight and their wonderful chlorophyll to manufacture food in the forms of sugar. Only plants and some forms of bacteria are autotrophic, self-feeding. Then we have the animal kingdom, which is probably the most familiar to you. Their cells have a nucleus, they are multicellular, and they are all linked by the feature that they are heterotrophic. They are all heterotrophs. That means they require the consumption of another organism to nourish themselves. Finally, we have the weird miscellaneous group called the protists or protoctists. These are linked by the features of having a nucleus, but they are also single-celled organisms like amoeba. They can actually have features from other kingdoms as well, mixed in. For example, there's a single-celled organism called Euglena, which actually has photosynthetic pigments, so it can photosynthesize as well as being heterotrophic, feeding on other organisms. So those are the 5 kingdoms. Remember, there'll be many, many species within each kingdom, but they'll only have very few things in common. So, prokaryotes, fungi, plants, animals, and protists. So next up we have the phylum. Now let's say we're looking at the animal kingdom. How can we further subdivide the animal kingdom? Well, the only one you need to remember, the only factor you need to remember is whether they have a supporting rod, okay, which will form backbones in vertebrates. If they do, we class them under the phylum Chordates or Chordata. So I've shown a picture of a snake here with its supporting rod, with its backbone. Invertebrates, however, do not have a backbone, for example, starfish, snails, and so on, so they would not be chordates. So that's one way to split the animal kingdom down the middle. Next up, we have class, which we're going to look at in more detail in a moment, but things like mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and so on. Then we have order, which you don't need to know too much about, so we would come from the order primates. So if we were looking at our classification, we are part of the animal kingdom, we are chordates, we are mammals, and we are primates. Then we have family, and our family would be hominid, sort of basically great apes with big brains. So you don't really need to focus much on these two other than know that they exist as groups, but the last two are very important. The genus and the species together make the binomial system devised by Linnaeus. So whenever a scientist is referring to a particular organism, they will refer to it by its Latin two-name name. So for example, we aren't called human beings. Internationally, we'd be referred to as Homo sapiens. And one of the most important points here, which they like testing on, is knowing that genus starts with a capital letter, but the species is always with a lowercase letter. So make sure, for example, if it's something like an S, which looks quite similar to the capital version, you've made it small. Otherwise, you will not get marks. I think it's also important to note at this stage what a species actually is. So you'll sometimes have to define it in an exam, and the easiest way to do it is using this sentence here. Members of a species, if you start with the word members, it's a lot easier. If you start a species is, you'll trip up over yourself. So start with members of a species can interbreed successfully, so sexually reproduce, to produce fertile offspring. This means the babies they produce at some later stage will be able to reproduce successfully themselves to carry on the species. The classic example of helping you understand this is take something like a horse and take something like a donkey. Now they can reproduce successfully, but what they produce is a mule, and mules are not fertile, they are sterile. They cannot reproduce themselves. So that's why horse and donkey are not members of the same species. Now, although this may seem like a nice, tidy definition, there are always exceptions to a rule in science. So firstly, some species reproduce asexually. So in other words, bacteria or prokaryotes, they don't require another partner to reproduce. They make clones of themselves through a process called binary fission. So you can see here the cell is just dividing to make a clone of itself. So that's a pretty major exception to basically for one definition to ignore an entire kingdom of organisms. Secondly, some different species can reproduce successfully to make fertile hybrids. This is very common in ducks, so different species of duck can reproduce to make a sort of intermediate hybrid. This is also true with many members of the dog family. Also, you may think that members of a species look very similar physically, but you just have to look at dogs to know that huge variation can exist within a species. I mean, just think of something like a Great Dane or Poodle and Chihuahua. Finally, ring species show that extreme ends of the variation spectrum cannot successfully reproduce. So some species of birds are ringed species, for example, gulls and some warblers. So take this example where we've got 5 different islands, and let's say this is where the species originated. So they start to spread out to avoid competition. As they do, they encounter new environments, so they start to vary in their features. Now still, they're quite genetically similar at this point for these species and these species to reproduce, just like these can. So neighbouring species can reproduce, but eventually as you keep them spreading out from your origin, each population of organism incurs so much genetic change that the extremes at the end cannot reproduce with each other because they're too genetically different. And that is how you can identify the 7 groups we use to classify all living organisms. So I said we'd come back and look at class because that's one of the major aims. How do we classify vertebrates? So the classes you would recognize are fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. But to understand how we classify them, you must get to grips with these words here. So there's 3 sets of features we use to classify vertebrates. Firstly, how do they regulate body temperature? So are they homeothermic, warm-blooded? Do they raise their body temperature through respiration, through the food they eat? Or are they poikilothermic or cold-blooded? In other words, does the environmental temperature determine their body temperature? Then we can look at how the fetus develops, so whether they are oviparous or viviparous animals. Oviparous are those which develop in eggs, and viviparous are those which develop in the womb. Vivi means inside the body. And then finally, how do they perform gas exchange? That's not the same as how do they perform breathing. Not all organisms breathe. So do they perform gas exchange through gills, through their skin, or through lungs? So first up, let's look at the mammals. Mammals are homeothermic, they are warm-blooded. They are viviparous, that means that the fetus develops inside the womb, and they perform gas exchange through their lungs. So that's how we can classify mammals. Next up, let's look at the birds. So birds are again homeothermic, they are warm-blooded. They can regulate their own body temperature. They are oviparous this time, they are egg-laying organisms, and they also perform gas exchange through lungs. So they have 2 things in common with mammals and 1 difference. Next we have reptiles. Let's see if you can work this out before I say it. So reptiles are poikilothermic, they lay eggs, they're oviparous, and they perform gas exchange through lungs. So 2 things in common with birds and 1 thing in common with mammals. So now let's look at amphibians, those that dwell on land and water. Really, amphibians need to lay their eggs in water. So amphibians, a bit like reptiles, are poikilothermic. They are oviparous, egg-laying. And as well as being able to perform gas exchange through lungs, they can also perform gas exchange through their skin, where oxygen can actually diffuse through their skin. But having quite a large volume, they do require lungs as well. And finally, let's look at fish. So fish are poikilothermic, cold-blooded, they're egg-laying, oviparous, and they perform gas exchange through gills. That's what's unique for fish. So in an exam question where you had to describe how you classify vertebrates, you'd say you can do it using 3 sets of features: regulating body temperature, or how they regulate body temperature, how the fetus develops, and how they perform gas exchange. You'd list every single type and then you'd give some examples. So fish, for example, well, they are poikilothermic, oviparous, and they perform gas exchange through gills. And that is how you describe how we classify vertebrates. So finally, let's look at the benefits of the binomial system, the 2-name system comprised of genus and species. Firstly, it's important to note that some countries may refer to different organisms with the same name. So for example, in this hypothetical situation, let's say one country calls this thing a grey squirrel, whereas in another country, they call this a grey squirrel. Clearly, they're 2 different species, although I have no idea what that is. So by using the binomial system, an international standard which we all refer to, then we avoid confusion with common names like the grey squirrel. So if we avoid confusion, secondly, it's easier to share information. So for example, let's say one scientist is calling another and trying to explain something. So it just says, we've just found out that Toxocara canis, that's a parasite, is transmitted through dogs. Having this binomial system ensures that the receiving end understands what we're talking about, which species we're talking about. And obviously, if we know what species we're talking about, it's much easier to focus conservation efforts. So ensuring that we know which species we're talking about, we can focus our conservation efforts much more efficiently. And those are the benefits of the binomial system.